Evening all and Happy New Year. Just a way of explanation of what I was doing in the titles there is that in 2020 I've decided I'm going to retrain as a barrister. And killing small furry animals with sporting equipment is one of the key skills you need to learn. My wife doesn't own a kimono though. That was a strange story, and I know it's a couple of weeks old now, but let me just touch on that at the start of this episode of The Biscuit. And that is what I found ironic was that there's Joe Morn, who in the past has said one of the things he's worried about Britain striking up trade deals with the United States is that it would negatively impact animal welfare in the United Kingdom. And it's ironic because he has negatively affected the welfare of one particular animal with a piece of iconic American sporting equipment. So, yeah, a bit ironic, but let's move on. So 2020 is here, and there were some of us in the aftermath of the general election and the win were thinking, well, what are we going to do next in 2020? Well, we have defeated our enemies. Well, any kind of. Objectively, well, and the list of objectives, we're making great inroads, those of us on the anti-left and who are in favour of Brexit. But the culture wars are still very much up for grabs. Now, there's a few people, I'm thinking in the news, like Gary Lineker, who have basically said, well, fair dues, we've lost an election, Brexit it is then. And he's kind of capitulated, but the hardcore ones are still frothing, they're still mad as anything. And Tony Blair's thrown his hat into the ring, saying he's going to try and lead some kind of rejoin the EU movement. So that's where it is. I mean, that was to be expected, a kind of rejoin movement, and well, good luck to them, they're going to need it. And we knew that there was going to be some aftermath with the Labour Party, that they're going to be looking for a new leader, and practically everybody's throwing their hat into the ring, and all of them are inadequate and face massive uphill struggles. They'll either choose somebody who will appeal to the mainstream of the country and be better at holding the current government to account, but then they won't be appealing to the Labour members, and they especially Momentum. Or on the other hand, they could go down the Momentum route, which case they'll be seen as completely unelectable by the majority of the country, and they will be in no better position in 5 years' time than they are now. So, yes, we're going to have to buckle down to more insanity, more wokeness for the time being. It's interesting to note the BBC have had a couple of flagship programmes that have not gone down well with Joe Public. First being an interpretation of Oliver Twist. Not Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol. Oh, they'll get to Oliver Twist at some point. But Christmas Carol, where it's kind of a lot darker and sweary, and people don't like it because it's sweary and it's Christmas Carol. To which various BBC hacks have been saying, oh yeah, but the story was always dark. It was never the cosy family story that you imagined it. And they swore in Victorian times as well. Crucially, there wasn't any swearing in Dickens. And frankly, this just seems to be an attempt to retcon the work. Now, A Christmas Carol is not an accurate depiction of Victorian life. It is a work of fiction, and it is set in a world recognisably Victorian, but Dickens was not writing some kind of verisimilitude piece. It's very much a morality tale, and you can try and inject too much realism into what is effectively the ghost of conscience of a man. Is basically it. So much is occurring in his imagination. So it's a lot of things, but woke it ain't. So anyway, they decided to do a version of Dracula where Dracula in this one is a bit of a geezer, isn't he? He's a bit of a wide boy, isn't he? Right, a little bit woo, a little bit wee. And Van Helsing is an atheist nun, of course she is, and there's some ethnic minorities in there, of course there are. and it's all being brought up to date and modernised and deconstructed and goodness knows what else by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, two men whose best days of script writing seem to be long behind them. But while television wages war against the viewers, the most interesting thing that's happened politically with me over the last 2 weeks was my time at New Year's. I spent New Year's with some old friends of mine who I've known for about 30 years. I don't want to give too many details away about these people because one or two of them might be watching, but they're all kind of left-leaning people, but not far left. They lean towards the left. And I was this wifey and myself were the sole right-wingers. And I didn't want to raise politics at all. You know, it's a time of just getting together and, you know, catching up on each other's lives. But they were pushing on the political front, but they weren't aggressive. They weren't nasty about it. They didn't berate me. And it's interesting because I'm there as a representative of the side who won. You know, they can't push me too much because they've, as far as I'm concerned, my team won convincingly, and won by appealing to a very wide section of the public. So they really haven't got grounds to go on. I mean, without going down that kind of mad paranoid stuff you see on Twitter. But it was interesting getting their perspective on things because they did come across as defeated. You know, they're defeated and they're still trying to piece together what's going on. Now, a couple of them, they're kind of internationalist types. You know, anywheres rather than somewheres. One couple. They work in sort of like the United Nations and the European Union itself, so that tips you off. So they're on message there, and they were saying they wanted to get out of the country before the force field goes up. You know, this force field that we're supposed to have that was going to cut us off and make us isolation, put us in complete quarantine with the rest of the world. It was utter nonsense. You know, a little bit of extra form filling in, but anyway, they're convinced that, but they were still very pleasant. But I say, come on, that's not going to happen. There's no barrier, there's no force field, there's no embargo, there's no isolationism. Come on, get real. This is my message over New Year's to them was all get real. Stop fantasizing about things. You know, the reality is things will change, but they're not going to be as dire as you've been led to believe. And I use that phrase, led to believe, deliberately, because I believe in having conversations with them and listening to what they had to say, that they, where they are politically is a system of beliefs that they have based upon things without thoroughly researching them. I was surprised at how little they knew about the workings of the European Union, particularly one friend of mine who's a teacher. I was talking to them about, well, you know, the basis of Brexit is the desire not to go into the federal union with the European Union. She said, well, what is this federalism? What is it? And I had to explain, you know, the EU's plan to federalise, you know, to make the European Union one country. And I explained things like the EU army, the common tax policy, the single currency, and so on and so forth. And rather than say, like a lot of FPPE types, oh, this will never happen, she was surprised that plans for a federal superstate were so far along. She didn't think it had been, that it was that mainstream in the European Union, that they were really pushing hard for it, and that they've put in a lot of the building blocks for it. So, you know, the according to the EU, its own timetable, it wants federalism by 2025. That's in official EU documentation. So she was kind of surprised to find that. I also explained how the European Parliament works. She thought it was democratic. I said, no, they've got all these special advisors that sit behind the MEPs. Things come down from the European Commission. I gave the example of the Copyright Act and said it gets bumped back up to the Commission. It keeps getting rejected by the Parliament. The Commission keeps sending it back. And then in the end, Parliament caves in and assents to this bill. And I explained why this new Copyright Act from the EU, why it was a bad thing. And she was generally surprised by this. That's just one bill. And I said, well, there's other things. This is how things operate. This kind of the way the EU is structured. I was trying to remember all the stuff that Chris Kirkblythe mentioned on his sadly lamented Twitter account, which has been shut down, but he was a fantastic resource for how EU law works. And she was genuinely surprised. And another friend of mine, one of my oldest and dearest friends, has said, well, the reason why the Conservatives won was because of Brexit. And I said, that's part of it. The other part of it is that people are rejecting socialism. And, he had to take that on board. I said, the public are just not as socialist as you think they are. I had another friend who's a Keynesian who just said, yeah, I agree, we can't go the full socialist, we can't go the full Corbyn. They're all united in their dislike of Corbyn, to be fair to them. It's interesting, these are essentially Blairites who are lost. They felt that Blair betrayed them over Iraq and over a number of other things, that they are, they're the type of people that think you should be seen to be doing something, or something must be done to help things. They're not free marketeers. The Keynesians, they're kind of, oh, isn't this terrible? We should do something about it. A little bit of hand wringing on that. And I don't want to be unfair to these people because, as I said, they're very old and dear friends, and they might be watching this. But I'm trying to fairly represent them as a kind of, as I said, centre left, a little bit more pro government intervention into things. Very concerned about people who are deprived. As I was saying, this teacher, she was worried that if we leave the EU, what would happen to employees' rights? What will happen to animal welfare? Long and short of it is that nothing need to change in that. If you think employment law in this country is fine, it's not going to change unless there's actually a big will to change. But the whole thing about being free of the EU is that you can adapt your employment laws to suit the national situation or the economic situation. And let us not forget that in a lot of employment law and stuff like that, we've been ahead of the European Union. Another thing, they were generally surprised that I said, that a lot of European countries work off the Napoleonic Code. And but Napoleon's been dead for 200 years. No, come on, get with it. The Napoleonic Code still is a thing. So rather than, some of the more based of you watching this might scoff and sneer, but I'd say be fair. This is something we know about because we've been immersed in the culture wars and we've read our political history and our economic history. But for a lot of people, including university educated people, they have not watched or seen this, and they've got their information through lots of filters. But the thing is that you can have good discussions with people. I still think you can have good discussions with people on the centre left, and you can try and reach out and you can try and inform and give them new information. I learned this during the general election, standing outside the polling booth with my blue rosette on, talking to my Lib Dem opposite number and just finding that there are a few things you can talk about reasonably and rationally, and you can make the right-wing point without getting lambasted. And I think what we need to do is take the centre-left and try, like in America last year, there was the walk-away movement. And I think we need to do this. We need to rescue, as it were, the centre-left away from the hard left, away from the woke, away from the politically correct brigade. And for me, I think the way of doing that is not being an asshole to people. Speaking of assholes, let's talk about Suleiman. What's going on in the Middle East? Now, I'm not going to go in on either a pro-interventionist here or an anti-interventionist here. You may say I'm sitting on the fence. But it's early days. I'm still processing a lot of information because, like most people, I'd not even heard of this Iranian general who's been killed. I hadn't heard of him before. And I'm finding out about him now. And I'm finding out about all the things he's done. And I'm hearing, because I know people who are pro-interventionists. I also know people who are anti-interventions, pacifists, left-wing pacifists, and also libertarian pacifists. So I'm taking all this information in, and this is why at this stage I'm not going to say whether killing him was a good or a bad thing. Will it lead to war? I don't know. I tend to think that, well, Iran's got to make it's kind of make a risk reward choice. Either they can escalate things, but will that end for them, or they make the protestations and they make some token responses and then just back away because do they think he's just one guy? He's just one guy. He was a powerful guy, and he was an influential guy in the region, but he's just one person, and the world moves on, and the regime wants to survive. So will it escalate? Will there be some saber rattling and then some de-escalation? I don't know at this stage. But one thing I will say about this, and that is, why didn't we hear about this Suleiman before? Why is it the vast majority of us are only learning about him now, only learning about his atrocities now? We've known there's been Iranian intervention in Middle Eastern terrorism and in persecution of people, particularly Christians. We've known about this for a while. The mainstream media chooses to sit on this information and not tell us, and now we're all supposed to make a snap judgment on it. And what I will say, given my knowledge of military history, is that if you're going to not engage, if you're going to let people like him exist in this world, and you don't want to get involved at all costs in the Middle East, and you just think the best thing for America and Europe is to completely back away, not do anything in that region. The thing to remember is that it doesn't make the problem go away in that region. Certainly doesn't make that problem go away in the region, and it will not be an insurance of protection for you either. One of the interesting things, I was looking at Twitter, and this was what a lot of left-wing pundit like Michael Tracy and a few others, and a few Iranians, pro-Iranians, I should say, were saying on Twitter, was that the Iranians have never forgotten or forgiven the US intervention in 1953. Bear that in mind, 1953. So we're coming up to nearly 70 years ago. And what you have there, nobody in the US administration at that time in 1953 is around today. Certainly not President Eisenhower, not the Dulles brothers, not anybody from that era. Anybody who was high up in the US government in 1953 is alive. And we're many presidents and a few generations removed from that time, and the logic and the reasoning that was employed at that time. We're far removed from it, and that to me shows you that you can never walk away now from the region and think you're safe, because there are peoples and cultures in this world that harbour very long grudges. There's so much about the breakup of Yugoslavia, and when it all descended into warfare between the nations that constituted Yugoslavia, that disputes that went back centuries, and that's in a European country. That centuries-old disputes are being resolved now, and if you were to walk away, if the United States were to walk away from Iran now and from the Middle East now, it would not stop people in that region, groups in that region, from hunting down the United States and carrying out acts of violence against them. That's not a pro-intervention argument. That's just facing up to reality. So if the United States were to adopt an isolationist foreign policy, it wouldn't stop bad things happening to them. You just have to weigh up: are you prepared to have acts of terrorism carried out against you? Are you prepared for U.S. business interests around the world to be legitimate targets? That American citizens around the world will be legitimate targets, and you'll just shrug it off and just go, we're still not getting involved. We still don't feel a need to protect our interests around the world. I'm not saying that's a bad position to take. I'm just saying that's something you will have to accept if you adopt an isolationist foreign policy. These things will come back. And are you prepared to just shrug it off, turn the other cheek? I know some people who would, and they could make a case for it. Or do you intervene? Well, what does intervention look like? And at this stage, I don't know what intervention looked like. They've killed one general. I mean, this is something that Barack Obama did weekly in his administration. Just send a drone to kill some terrorist functionary around the world. And this is the first time Trump has done anything like this, but it's very dramatic. This plays into the philosophical argument that if you could go back in time and kill Hitler, would you, knowing all the woe and destruction? And so this is kind of a bit of a variation on that. If you now can take out someone who has committed atrocities and prevent them from committing more atrocities, would you do it? So that's something to, again, bear in mind when weighing up the decision. But certainly, it's, for me, I'm adopting a watch this space, gather as much information as possible. I'm not going to fall into line. I'm not going to fall in line with hawks, conservative hawks, or neocons, all these ridiculous labels that get bandied about. I'm not going to be. I'd never back the Groypers. I can't stand them. But I'm not going to play. I'm not going to toe the line with the left or the hawks or the pacifists or anything. I just want to observe, gather information, see what happens. Because at the end of the day, I don't make the decision to pull the trigger on these things. But speaking as somebody who, kind of the amateur historian, I just want to gather the information and process it. So let's see what 2020 brings us, apart from war with Iran, maybe. But let's see what happens in the culture wars. I think there's going to be plenty to sink our teeth into as the weeks and months come ahead. But I will probably see you all on the Britishers This Week in History live stream. It's coming Thursday as everything gets back into full swing. So I hope you've had a great Christmas and New Year. I will see you next week.